Autopsy doctors of Reddit, what was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? Not mine, but a doctor I used to work with. Back when he was in school, he would do his cadaver labs really late at night to many people during the day. One time it was really late, around 2 AM. He was listening to his lecture on his headphones and he saw the cadaver's arm move twitch. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Then he saw it again, proceeded to run away in a panic. He told a few of his classmates what happened, but nobody believed him. Next day they had a group cadaver lab with the same cadaver. The arm twitched yet again. The professor did some digging and it turns out the patient's pacemaker was still fully functional and occasionally fired, causing the arm twitch. He was so relieved. He thought there was a zombie in there. The professor did some digging. Literally. My dad used to perform autopsies. His best story was that they were brought a body that has no real indication of any issues. After examining the body, the only thing of note was that there was blood coming out of the guy's rectum. They begin the autopsy and the guy's organs are completely liquefied and the body cavity is filled with lead shot. It became apparent really quickly that someone had shoved a shotgun up his butt and pulled the trigger. This was in the 70s and I still have to wonder what this guy did to pee someone off enough to get a shotgun up his butt. Not exactly an autopsy per se, but it was a patient found unresponsive, with CPR in progress by EMS. The man was clearly homeless, based on his appearance and smell. He reportedly had not been seen for several days by his friends, and was eventually found behind a fast food restaurant dumpster. We were briefly able to get a pulse back, and when the nurse cut his pants off to place a catheter we saw the cause. He had fashioned some sort of makeshift cock ring out of the neck of a plastic bottle. It was way too tight and completely cut off the circulation. The dong was fully black and necrotic. I did a bedside ultrasound and found his abdomen full of free fluid, which is bad. Most likely his bladder had ruptured from being unable to urinate for days. His labs suggested he was in septic shock and full-blown renal failure as well. He did not survive much longer than that. I remembered another one. In my final year of training we had a cadaver lab to practice advanced airway management techniques. For example, difficult intubation, cricothyroidotomy, etc. While I was helping an intern do a basic intubation, she commented the tube wouldn't pass. I think she has some kind of growth or mass in her airway. I took a look, asked for some forceps, and pulled a half-eaten hot dog out of her larynx. It of course had been embalmed along with the rest of her. Cause of death identified. Oh god, this one is terrible. Poor guy, that must have been excruciating. Medical examiner here. This probably isn't a big wow revelation, but it certainly made an impact on me. Very early in my career, I did an exam on another doctor who worked at the hospital where I trained. I didn't know this gentleman personally but was acquainted with him by reputation. He was a very happy-go-lucky sort, much loved by everyone in his department. He died unexpectedly at a young age of what turned out to be a drug overdose on pharmaceuticals he had been diverting from the hospital. I don't think anybody saw that coming, myself included. It was a lesson to me that anybody can fall victim to addiction, and that it's hard to know what anybody's private struggles are. Medical student here, and this story is from anatomy class. One of the cadavers in our class died of cancer, and when we took out the gentleman's liver it was very large and full of bumps all over. The liver itself was also hard as a rock. The poor man's cancer had spread all over his liver and was full of tumors. It really hit home that this was what cancer was like and demonstrated its pure destructive nature. We have a man's liver in a pot at my uni and it is rather large, but more importantly it looks Dalmatian spotted with metastatic melanoma. After that class I immediately made an appointment for that afternoon to organize a biopsy on what turned out to be one on my arm. I am not a pathologist, but when my father died from drowning, it was noted he had acute cirrhosis of the liver. The coroner also removed a bullet from between his heart and spine that dad received in Vietnam. It was very degraded. He had also lost a thumb and several feet of intestine there, the evidence of which was noted in the report. Dad had served 22 years in the army, and he had been awarded the Purple Heart 3 times. He lived a hard life after, and it was speculated he would have passed soon of cirrhosis of the liver had he not drowned. My friend had to do an autopsy on a baby. The dad claimed she died after rolling off a couch. My friend found that the kid was slammed against a hard surface multiple times. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall after she wouldn't stop crying. My friend had to quit that job cause it was so taxing mentally. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall after she wouldn't stop crying. The sad part about this is that babies sometimes just cry. There is nothing wrong with them. They are tired and just can't sleep. Not a doctor, but I did a necropsy on one of my birds a couple weeks ago. I couldn't tell how she died before it happened, but after opening her up I found about 14 masses of tissue in her reproductive system. At first I thought it was cancer from dissecting one of the masses. Later I found out it was actually an intestinal infection. It was actually a reproductive tract infection. I had to do one on one of my birds the other day too. She had a mass of fluid the size of a closed fist inside her 150 grams of fluid weight. It was pushing everything inside to the outside and we never even saw that coming. Cystic oviduct. I'm sorry about your bird. I'm a med student, not a pathologist or coroner. But in anatomy lab the tank next to me had a donor with an inflatable dong pump inside his scrotum and shaft. It was completely self-contained. Fluid in the container in the scrotum could be pumped into the shaft tube, creating an erection. Then the fluid would just be released back into the pump and the boner would go away. Pretty wild. I'm a medical student, not a doctor, but when I dissected my cadaver in my first year, it had lots of surgical markings and was pretty overweight. After I'd been able to work through all the parts of the body with my group, we were able to piece together with our lab leader that our donor had been in and out of the hospital for a quadruple bypass, followed by a pacemaker, a stomach stapling, and then what looked like an emergency open heart surgery that she died during. Not a rare disease or strange occurrence per se, but it was interesting finding clues around the body as we learned anatomy. In university I applied and got into the presection lab. Basically, we got the fresh pickled cadaver and dissected it for the anatomy lab. We weren't told anything about his medical history or cause of death. List of things we found: metal fragments in his quad and calf. Sternum was wired together. Old surgery. Blood jelly in the brain. Old school stent above the heart. There were other weird things. Mostly though I still struggle with the smell of pepperoni because it's so similar to embalmed corpse. Found that out after prosecuting for a few hours and then going to the cafeteria for pepperoni pizza and then vomiting said pepperoni pizza. Not an autopsy doctor, but did take anatomy and physiology too with lab in college. The lab was working on cadavers being prosecuted by more advanced students. A presection is the dissection of a cadaver, human or animal, or part of a cadaver by an experienced anatomist in order to demonstrate for students anatomic structure. Anyway, one of the cadavers, we had a male and a female for obvious reasons, was a big ol' linebacker looking dude. And older bodybuilder type if I recall correctly. His age at time of death was late 50s. His heart has been removed by the anatomist, and we were examining it because it was very enlarged and contributed to his death. We all had to hold it in our hands to feel the heft, like size and weight, and compare it to the heft of the female's heart, which was normal sized, about like a large apple. The male's heart, for comparison, was the size of a small cantaloupe. I went first, for whatever reason, and the instructor lifted the enlarged heart out of its preservative bath and placed it in my hands. I dang near dropped the thing when it shocked me with what felt like a jolt of electricity. I, understandably, I think, made a startled noise, and the instructor took the heart back before I could juggle it onto the floor. "Oh," she said, "I forgot to warn you. Look out for the pacemaker." Apparently when someone has a pacemaker there's a battery too and they don't bother taking it out of. They just snip the leads and leave it there. So if you touch both bare leads you get a mild shock, even through your exam gloves. That was a mildly disturbing experience. Not a doctor, but my family requested an autopsy of my grandfather so we could, hopefully, get some answers about how he died. Our family has a history of unusual medical conditions. Shout out to my ancestors who were massively inbred until 100 or so years ago. So we wanted to see what made him so sick leading up to his death. We never got a clear answer, unfortunately, but we did get an amazing summary of their findings. In the autopsy report, they listed all of my grandfather's body parts. Now, Papa was a large man. It stands to reason that his body parts would be a bit larger than the average guy. The list of body parts went something along the lines of heart, above average, liver, above average, brain, above average, all the way down to testicles, average. I've never laughed harder at average sized testicles. I am a pre-med student, and one time while shadowing a forensic pathologist, 3 days before Christmas, he was doing an autopsy on an automobile versus pedestrian accident. The man's face was completely smashed in. When they take samples of the brain, they cut the skin, pull it over the face, and they cut off the top of the skull. When they did that, the skull was basically shattered and bone fragments pulled back with the skin, and when they cut off the skull cap, the brain was obviously damaged and the eyeballs had been pushed back, fallen through the orbits and into the cranial cavity. But the guy also had $10,000 in cash in his jean pockets. According to police, he had a record involving drugs, so the theory was either a drug deal gone bad or he stumbled into the road while under the influence. My friend once cremated a lady, and when they pulled the table out, there were 3 sets of forceps sitting there. Most likely she died in surgery, but I always thought it was crazy those were left in, and whatever metal they're made of clearly has a higher melting point than cremation temps. After my mother was cremated, my sister was curious and wanted to take a peek at her ashes inside the urn. She opened it and said, "Oh, right on top of these fine ashes was the hardware from the broken ankle repair she had gotten years before." While in medical school, we had to observe an autopsy and could assist. One of the lectures was to observe for head trauma. You do this by hitting the skull with a hard object, scissor or the like. A hollow sound is normal, but a dull sound indicates trauma. One of the other students did this exam and found a dull sound. The coroner had not yet himself examined the person and was very surprised, as he had not been informed by the police of head trauma. They then continued to examine the head and they found a gunshot wound through the skull. All of a sudden the person was a crime scene and they had to call the police again and leave the person as untouched as possible. I believe it was later confirmed that the person had shot himself, but it could have been a murder. Anyone pointing out there must have been some information that was missed between the police and coroner. I myself was not present, but I do believe the story is true, as it is now a lecture in why you should always examine for skull trauma and not just assume something before knowing. When I was a med student in my final year, I did a placement in forensic medicine. Had a body come in. Some guys had gone to the cops and said their friend had died after he'd fallen and smacked his head on a coffee table a few weeks prior, and, in a panic, they dumped his body in the median of one of the big highways. This is in the middle of summer. By the time he was brought in, he was pretty significantly decomposed, but his body was still intact. Autopsy revealed a small subdural hemorrhage, bleed in the brain, consistent with the story. Then we discovered a ruptured liver. The laceration was about 10-15 centimeters long, spleen, and heart, as well as a complete collection of broken ribs. This guy hadn't just fallen and hit his head on a coffee table. He had been beaten to death with excessive force. Turned from a suspicious death to a homicide case pretty quickly after that. When I worked for the ME office, a pathologist came and got all of us to check out a post she was doing. The guy had what's called situs inversus. All his organs were backward, left lung on the right, stomach on the right, etc, etc. No mention of it in his medical history. I took forensic lectures, so I saw quite a bit of crazy crap, but the things that stick is an autopsy revealing a history of abuse, pain and violence. A little more funny, a skeleton was found in the near mountains. It was very clear he died in an accident 20+ years ago. However, he had to be identified via DNA. Turned out his dad was not his dad, but his uncle. Sparked a whole public family drama show, cause the family was well known in my area. We found your son that went missing 2 decades ago. Also, you're with cheated an hour with your brother Havigadone. I am not a doctor, but I did an internship in a coroner's office for a summer. My job was to help with autopsies, clean up the office, dispose of old bags of organs. Bags with pieces from each organ are required to be kept for 5 years unless homicide, SIDS, or unknown cause of death, data entry, and other odds and ends. 2 stories that really stick out. On my first day I was to help with an autopsy of a homeless man who was living in a storage unit. Remind you it's the summer. He was relieving himself in buckets that he also kept in the storage unit. He died in there and wasn't found for a month. Anyways, when we rolled him out into autopsy you could smell him through the bag. It was so bad. I can't articulate how bad it was, but I was gagging and we hadn't even started. But then something weird happens. One of the techs puts a sheet down on the floor before we roll the cart onto it. I'm like, why? We're gonna have a disgusting stinky sheet now. That's when the bag is opened, and I don't see a body. I see hundreds of maggots crawling all over and they start to fall off the cart. I was then informed I had to stomp on all the maggots as they fell so they didn't spread throughout the building. So here I am, playing the worst game of Dance Revolution in history over a half liquefied skeleton holding my nose so I don't puke. The other story is that in the basement where we would keep all the organ bags and stuff like that, we also had notable objects from old crime scenes like murder weapons, etc. For some reason there were a lot of jars of fetuses, but that's a different story. Anyways, there was a butt plug in a bag that had the case number written on it. Now I found this during the first week of my internship, and I kept wondering, how does someone die by a butt plug? Now I had access to all case files as I had to enter data and all that jazz. So eventually I ended up looking up the case and it turns out an older guy had it in as he was jacking off to a magazine called The Spanking Times. Obviously he died as his butt plug was in our office, but the autopsy showed he had a heart attack presumable as he climaxed. I suppose there are worse ways to go. Not an autopsy doctor, but thought this would be the place to share the story. I spent every winter break during high school cutting down trees and splitting wood. We used a hydraulic splitter connected to the back of our tractor. One cold winter afternoon we cut down this really old red oak. One of those old, yet still strong trees your father's father even said was big when he was a child. Anyway, after using the chainsaw to cut up manageable sections, I threw a chunk up on the splitter and the oak cracked open. About half a foot into the oak, there was a nest of hair inside. Didn't think much until we cut the half chunk into quarters and then the splitter got jammed up on a chain. Upon closer inspection we saw some fossilized indentations that looked like a jawbone. We called the authorities. Game warden. Next day homicide squad was out in our woods. After a few weeks we got news that someone was chained up to the tree and left to die. Over many years the tree grew around the body. Never could find DNA match to anyone in family or missing persons. So, yay. I'm a veterinarian and sometimes I do necropsy, basically autopsy for animals, and one of the more notable case involved a prized Wagyu cow that died mysteriously. Wagyu cows are very expensive to rear and fetch a good price at the slaughterhouse. After cutting her open, I found metal wires extending from her stomach into her heart. It's what we call hardware disease. Apparently the cow decided that eating metal wires for constructing fences was a good idea. Normally the farm hands are quite good at keeping these hazards away from the inquisitive bovines, but I guess slip-up do happen from time to time. Holy crap. I get freaked out when my cat finds a stray rubber band, like produce rubber band, and pukes up the chewed up remnants. I can't imagine any creature eating metal wire. Totally not related but somewhat related. My sister-in-law works in medicine, and one of her classes involved studying and dissecting cadavers. One day in class they wheeled in a body and when they pulled back the sheet, a girl fainted when she realized it was her aunt. I'll keep this out of the main thread with the other unrelated stuff. Have a friend that was vegetarian because she had to attend dissections for pharmacy. Apparently slicing human muscle was too much like roast beef for her. Not a forensic pathologist or ME, but I occasionally liaised with an office as part of local print media in the aughties. Many fascinating stories, but the one that stuck with me, no pun intended, was from an ME who discovered, while dissecting a man's heart, that he had killed himself by first heating peanut butter to a liquid and then injecting it. It reached his heart and clogged it up, and that's an image my brain still loves to dwell on now and then. RIP. Reese's in pieces. I'm not a doctor but my uncle, dad's only brother, died when he was 17 in a car accident in 1975. They did an autopsy and told my grandparents he died on impact and didn't suffer. My dad personally knew the autopsy doctor and he told him that he didn't die on impact. He suffered for a bit and had internal bleeding and that's what ultimately caused his death. My dad hasn't and will never tell his parents. As someone who is waiting on autopsy results from the coroner on a loved one, I find this incredibly fascinating and frightening at the same time. Bad accident during high school, missing scalp of young girl, coroner couldn't find it. My buddy worked at impound yard and found it embedded in broken windshield frame glass. Pretty gruesome. I'm not a pathologist but I work in a field adjacent to it. One patient was heart attack caused by CUs. The heart was apparently giant, like having to use C just to keep the heart going. My dad used to be a pathologist assistant and had to quit after a teenage suicide around the age of my brother, then a couple or 3 SIDS cases, which is sudden infant death syndrome, in the same week. I visited a dissection lab at a nearby university when I was in high school and one guy was laid out on the table in front. We asked how he died and the professor pointed at a jar and said that's how, and it was the guy's heart. It was bigger than his head. In college I took a figure drawing class and the teacher was adamant that you couldn't draw the figure if you didn't know what was in it, so he dragged us over to the anatomy lab and had the anatomy teacher show us 2 cadavers that were being dissected by their med students. When it came time to ask questions, of course, have you ever found something weird in a body came up. The story is as follows. They get a body, and for legal reasons they aren't told much about the person aside from medical history. They were told that the old man was a sort of rock star type and was a one-hit wonder from his youth and to use extra discretion with him, in particular not tell the students who might recognize him. The lab is full of 20-year-olds and so nobody recognized who he was. Unsure if the teacher even knew, but it didn't sound like she did, or what his deal was, so they wrote it off as non-useful information aside from his lifestyle. He had drug use and alcohol issues in his life and they were told he partied a lot. Cool. The body has a raging boner, like 100% of the time. Teacher doesn't think much of it aside from that he was particular endowed and everybody wrote it off as not important to their studies. So they go through the general dissection that they do. One kid wants extra credit and the teacher said sure, dissect his dong, see why it's hard still and write a report. Apparently they don't normally do that for that particular class, so the dong itself goes untouched from their dissection, so it would have otherwise always been a mystery. Kid finds an actual rod that he had medically inserted under the table, not in medical records, so that he would always have a boner and could get it up while on drugs. They suspect it was done over 30-40 years prior to his death. They removed it and keep it in the lab, I believe, to show their students as part of a section on under the table medical surgeries. Anyways, that was probably the best day in figure drawing class I've ever had. I'm a former police officer and attended several autopsies to record info for investigation files. One guy had been shot and killed, so the cause of death was pretty plain, but the pathologists doing the autopsy found a tumor the size of a walnut on his brainstem. He said the guy would have been dead in a few months even if he hadn't been shot. Another guy was dead due to a steak knife being stabbed through his heart by his wife. She claimed she grabbed the knife because she was scared he was going to kill her, and when he lunged at her the knife just went in. But when the doctor pointed out a half dozen or so marks that looked like freckles around the wound, he swabbed to develop a solution that clearly showed they were tiny little poke marks. I was able then to get her to confess that he was goading her. Go ahead, do it, until she hauled off and cabbed him. It's not always like TV shows where the autopsy is the aha moment that solves a case, but sometimes it really is. When I was young I knew a 19-year-old guy that was found dead in his apartment. The landlord was convinced it was an OD. Family asked for an autopsy. It was type 1 diabetes. He was undiagnosed. Probably felt like heck and went into shock and died. Very sad case. If he had gotten medical care in time, he probably would have lived. And then the police sent the bill for the autopsy to the family to add insult to injury. That was back in 1990. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.